really take our economy off the rails here and really threaten our position is a negative shock to the property market. And that is what I think is the more contemporary note that we should be focusing on. I mean, what the RBA said in 2014 was addressed by APRA, and it worked.
An independent economist, Saul Westlake, joins us now from Hobart. Saul Westlake, good morning. So this memo says any change which discourages negative gearing may be good from a financial stability perspective. In layman's terms, what does that mean?
Well, what that means is that at the time, in December 2014, the Reserve Bank had become increasingly concerned at the extent to which borrowing by investors for the purchase of property was putting upward pressure on property prices, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne. There was a time in 2014 and early 2015 when investors accounted for more than half of all borrowing for purchase of properties, and some of that borrowing, an increasing proportion of that borrowing, was seen by the Reserve Bank as being risky, particularly the high proportion of that borrowing that was interest-only borrowing. So the Reserve Bank, responding, it seems, or at least an officer of the Reserve Bank, responding, it seems, to the recommendations of David Murray's inquiry into the Australian financial system, which did recommend that the government look at scaling back negative gearing and or the capital gains tax discount. This note from within the Reserve Bank was suggesting that that could be a good thing from a financial stability perspective. That is, reducing the amount of risk that there is in the financial system.
So how does that then reflect on Malcolm Turnbull's statement that Labor's policy would smash house prices?
Well, it reflects badly on that assertion because the report asks, or the note asks, what might happen if negative gearing were to be abolished, and it raises two possibilities. One, that it could result in increased rents, and I notice that government spokespeople are accepting that as a statement of opinion from the Reserve Bank. And then in the second dot point, it says it could result in lower property prices or large-scale selling by investors, but then goes on to say that if any change to negative gearing were to be grandfathered, that would be unlikely. Now, this report, this note, was written before Labor's policy had been promulgated, as was the Bish-Shrapnel report released earlier this year, which the government was quite keen to quote in its defence and in support of its attacks on Labor's policy. This note from the Reserve Bank was written before Labor's policy was promulgated, but it does say that if negative gearing changes were to be grandfathered, it's unlikely that there would be large-scale selling by investors of their property, and hence it's unlikely that there would be any significant adverse impact on property prices. And in fact, we can go a bit further in exploring the comments that have been made by both the Treasurer and the Finance Minister this morning. They've pointed to the action that APRA, the regulator of banks, has taken with the support of the Reserve Bank since this note was written, which those measures have been designed to dampen down lending to investors by getting the banks to tighten their lending criteria. Now, those measures have been effective. As the Treasurer and Finance Minister have pointed out, there is less borrowing by investors, or less lending to investors for the purchase of property for investment. Now, that's actually what the effect of Labor's policy will be as well. It won't have any impact on those who already have negatively geared properties, but it will discourage further borrowing for the purchase of established properties, not new properties, but established properties. And if it's true, as it is, that the measures which have been taken under this government's watch by APRA to dampen demand from investors for the purchase of investment properties hasn't caused the sky to fall in, then neither will what Labor's proposing cause the sky to fall in. And the government has actually taken another series of steps to dampen investor demand for established property. That is by beefing up the supervision and regulation of purchases of established properties by foreign investors. Now again, that dampens the demand for property from investors, in this case foreign investors. The government has implemented that policy and the sky has not fallen in. So what I think the Reserve Bank is saying, albeit before Labor's policy was announced, is that if negative gearing were to be curtailed, but grandfathered for those who already have it, the sky would not fall in. There would not be large-scale selling of existing properties, and therefore it's wrong, in my view, to say that this change would lead to a catastrophic fall in property prices, as the government keeps alleging.
But if, as you say, the policies that have been instituted in the last couple of years have worked to dampen investor interest in property, why is there any need to take that further?
Well, I would argue, and this is my view, not the Labor Party's, that negative gearing still preferences investors who typically have access to bigger deposits because they already have at least one property in many cases, and in effect gives them a subsidy on their mortgage costs so that it enables them to outbid would-be owner-occupiers at auctions and in other property sales. And I think it's one reason, it's not the only reason, but it's one reason why home ownership rates have been falling so dramatically among people aged between 25 and 55 since the early 1990s. And the Reserve Bank's comments are consistent with what the Reserve Bank has been saying for more than a decade. In 2003, the Reserve Bank made quite a detailed submission to a Productivity Commission inquiry into first home ownership, and while it did not advocate changes to negative gearing explicitly, it did point out how the availability of negative gearing in Australia was much more generous than in other countries and had contributed to the increased presence of investors in the housing market, potentially to the detriment of would-be first home buyers. And my understanding is that the Reserve Bank actually wanted to be much more forthright about this, but was dissuaded from being more explicit about its views on the impact of negative gearing on the property market by pressure from the then Treasurer. So what the Reserve Bank is saying here, what is in this note from an officer within the Reserve Bank, is consistent with the Reserve Bank's long-held views on this subject.
So what do you make of the government's argument that this is an old internal document that does not represent the official position of the RBA?
Well, it's not a statement from the Governor or the Deputy Governor. It's not a statement from the Board. So from that point of view, it may not reflect an official position in the way that, for example, an appearance before the House of Representatives, Economics Committee, or the Statement on Monetary Policy last Friday did, although it is consistent with previous official statements by the RBA that do come under those kind of headings. The government can't really have it both ways, though. It can't say that the views expressed in this note about the possibility of changes to negative gearing leading to higher rents are legitimate, but the views expressed in the same note about the grandfathering of negative gearing, changes to negative gearing, limiting the impact on existing investors, it can't say that that's out of date whilst taking a bit that appears to be in line with its own argument, that's okay. And they can't really say that having presided over two measures themselves that have dampened demand from domestic and foreign investors for established properties without the sky having fallen in at all, they can't really say that another measure which is designed to have exactly the same effect would cause the sky to fall in when the two measures they've endorsed haven't.
Okay, so let's